Welcome to this lecture on space, shape, and mass. Works of art have a presence in space that is real. Even if they're only hanging on a wall, it's real space. They often also provide an illusion of space. So in this lecture, we're going to talk about that use of space, but also about shape and mass and how it relates to space. So let's start out by talking about shape. Now, shape is used for flat shapes. They're two-dimensional, the result of color and line, figure and ground that all work together. We're starting out very basic here, but let's look at kinds of shapes. Like lines, shapes can be organic. They can be biomorphic, or they can be geometric. And here we've got just an assortment of different little shapes for you to look at, and you'll notice that the ones that are organic are these natural forms that don't have any particular shape. And then we have the geometric ones, the circles, the squares, the rectangles, and the ovals. And we have automatic associations go with all of these. I'll give you one example. If you have the classic kidney-shaped pool, you have a very natural understanding of shapes. And I'll bet anything that that swimming pool will have some nice plantings around it. You'll think about gardens next to it. But if you have the classic Olympic-style rectangular swimming pool, you're going to probably have more paving around it and grass because you're more interested in those kinds of shapes and those associations. Now, if you don't have a swimming pool, not to worry. You can see this is very complicated and you probably don't want to get into it. But let's start out by looking at some of the shapes in a work of art. This is the work of Raphael. It's called The Betrothal of the Virgin from 1504. Now, the temple in the background, plus all of the stones in the piazza, are geometric, which makes the foreground assembly of figures really stand out. Each one, in that case, is a biomorphic shape, consisting of smaller sections of the figures, all, of course, organic shapes because they're related to the biomorphic origins. And this is repeated with figures in the background. Now, it could be somewhat complicated with that many figures, and some of them are even walking, but there are a lot of things here that we could see that are helping us to concentrate on the focal point. And in fact, a lot of people say that they see this as a rather simple composition, and they always love to focus in on the focal point, which is the hands reaching out right in the center for the exchange of a ring. Now, one of the things that makes us feel this way is that it's a very symmetrical work, and we focus on the middle. There's also a lot more color in the front, which keeps us there, but especially the contrast of geometric shapes in the background with biomorphic shapes definitely helps us also to organize this huge space and to make it majestic rather than overwhelming. Like lines and like colors, shapes can be expressive. And here we just have to pause and look at how we make these associations. Perfectly centered geometric shapes, like a circle or a square, we associate with perfection, but also with stability. Less perfectly regular geometric shapes, like ovals or hexagons, are visually more lively, and we read them as more interesting, a little less stable. Biomorphic shapes are exactly that. They read as natural and irregular and always lively. So let's take a look at this work of art. It's by Vasily Kandinsky. He's French, was born Russian. The title is In the Circle, and it dates from 1911. Now, all we have here is one, as he says in the title, one giant circle. But beyond that, we have some frantic lines, a lot of movement there. But the main thing is all of these organic shapes and biomorphic shapes that are scattered throughout the circle. And they add a dynamism and a movement. It's a very lively organic swirl. The irregularity at the same time is very natural, and it adds to this. Now let's pretend that we're replacing that without all those extra shapes and without all that other reference to organic shapes in particular. If we looked at just the plain circle, we'd read that as stable and fixed, and after looking at the Kandinsky, I dare say, boring. Now let's turn to what shapes do for us in relationship to one another. And we call this, with shapes, figure ground. This is a vase I'd like you to look at for a little bit, and it's called the Royal Silhouette Vase. It was made in 2000, a replica of the original vase made for Queen Elizabeth II's Silver Jubilee of 1977. As you can see, it's white, and it has an emblem in gold on the front, and it has a repeat of that gold on the top of the circle of the opening of the vase. So you've looked at the vase. Now, that is the figure. When you're looking at it and you're seeing that most, that's the figure. Now try to focus on the background, the black around it. Can you see? When you make the black into the figure, it should suddenly appear to be two profiles. Here, Prince Philip on the left and Queen Elizabeth on the right. That's figure ground. I love it. It means that every shape can be either the figure and the void around the shape will be the ground, or every shape has the potential to be the ground, making the supposed void read as the figure. Let's look at an art example. This is Henri Matisse, a French artist, and this is his Dance from 1909. Now, the immediate figure here is the figures, and you will note that the shapes, the figures themselves, are nicely made by the combination of color and line, in this case in very curvilinear lines, and therefore the shapes are all biomorphic. They're very calm, which is how we read them, and even in this case, lyrical. Now focus on the ground. Look at the very middle void that is in blue, that I think looks almost like a woman's torso. It's a beautiful curvilinear shape of its own, not unlike the shape that we just saw in the last lecture in that Picasso drawing. Now look at the areas that have both blue and green as part of the ground. Each area also has a curvilinear line or an implied line between the two colors. So what we're really looking at is a remarkable, very lyrical, elegant system of interlocking and interrelated shapes using only 3 colors plus black. It's seemingly simple, but actually very complex. So think of the various shapes that we see here as almost puzzle pieces, and the entire design on the canvas is revealed. The beauty of the shapes is never the single shape themselves, but the relationship of those shapes together. Okay, let's try another. This is a work by Barnett Newman. It's an American artist, and the title is Vir Heroicus Sublimis, and it's from 1950 to 51. And you may look at this and say, what's the point? It looks like a big red rectangle. Well, actually, it is the subtle exploration of the space and shape that is intended to slow you down and actually produce a pretty awe-inspiring visual, possibly, some people say, even spiritual experience. Now, hang in there with me, because it is a subtle exploration of the whole idea of a rectangle. First of all, you need to know this canvas is huge. It's almost 18 feet across. So when you're looking at it from far away, it's still overwhelming. If you go up close, it almost engulfs you. It is so large. So it's this flat surface, huge, covered with consistent red paint. And then it is vertically intersected by 5 strips of lines, and the artist called them zips. I don't know why. All the shapes are rectangular. As soon as you put a line introduced to that red color, you have a shape, and the shape in each case is a rectangle. So here there's 5 zips, and that results in 6 shapes. The smallest little shape is that very small stripe at the very far right of the canvas. Now, the effect when you're standing in front of it is that there are a lot of retinal after images, and we learned already that looking at all that red is going to produce a lot of green on our retina. So you can imagine how each shape or each zip could gradually become either the figure or the ground. So you're standing there, you're paying attention, and you begin to see these shapes, including the zips themselves, come forward or recede as you're trying to take all this in. It's quite an impressive painting, based only on the creation of rectangular shapes. Now let's turn to the illusion of space. on a two-dimensional canvas, we often see the illusion of three-dimensional space. Now, we will be talking about perspective later in depth, I promise. But here, I just want to look at a couple basics of illusionism. The basics of illusion that I just want to address today are several, and so we'll go through them one by one. The first is overlapping. And what you're seeing here is a simple line drawing of a dog and a column. Now, look at those. Are they flat? And you'd say, yes, they absolutely are flat. Could they possibly represent any kind of space? No, because they're absolutely flat. Now look what happens. All we're going to do is move the dog behind the column. Is there space? Well, you have to admit there's some kind of space going on, because now if I said, where's the dog? You'd say he's trying to hide behind the column. So that is the most basic. Sometimes it's so basic that we don't even think about it. But that is one basic way of showing the existence of space. Now the second is shading. And shading treats flat surfaces with the illusion that some parts of those surfaces are in bright light while others are in shadow, because the bright light areas are closer to the viewer and the shadows are further away, giving the illusion of being rounded or mass. Shading, by the way, which in painting uses black, does have a special term. It's called chiaroscuro. And I just want to show you how this works right now. If I hold up a basic flat shape, like this piece of paper, and you know it's flat, I feel like a magician, you know that the light hits this very evenly, and we see that as flat. But if we were to just roll this so it becomes something that does take up shape and space, then all of a sudden we can't help it. We see that the light hits the front of this differently than it hits the side. It should be bright light here, and it should be less light there, because the light comes directly and reflects in the foreground, but on the side it hits and refracts. And so all that these illusionistic things are doing is taking what we see every day in real life, what we recognize as being that's in the front, this is the side, it must be shaded. The artist just gives that back to you, and you interpret it as saying, oh, I see it. Now look at our dog and look at the column. One side of them is slightly shaded, and they're starting to look a little bit more like there's even more space, and that they're taking up more space. Now, the last of the three devices that I just wanted to mention today is shadows. Because look what happens when we add shadows to the column and to the dog. Again, because in real life, we see something that takes up space, and it has different shading around it, and we see that it casts its own shadow, we know that that takes up more space. So the artist gives it back to you. They give you a perfectly painted shadow, and we've added more and more illusion of space. So let's see how these three things work in a work of art. This is Caravaggio's, an Italian artist. It's The Calling of St. Matthew from 1599 to 1602. And we have all three devices at work here. Overlapping certainly works. If we look at the figure of the young man who's seated with his back towards us, he is in turn overlapping the table, that in turn overlaps the young man with the feathered cap behind the table, and that figure overlaps the wall. And so with each successive overlapping, we are reading successive notions of space. And also there's a lot of shading in here that helps give us sense that these figures are definitely taking up space on their own. Notice the figure in the far left, seated with his head down. And look at the way Caravaggio has handled the lighting on his thigh. He has a very bright light on the top of the thigh, but then it goes almost immediately, and this would be chiaroscuro because he does use black, into shade. And what that does is that we turn around and read that just the way we read what was happening to that piece of paper when it suddenly took up space. We read that as, yeah, that's a real thigh. That's got muscles, that's got existence there. And finally, Caravaggio is known for being a master of shadow when he wants to be. And you have a very explicit shadow going on in this work that comes in from apparently an open window on the upper right of the canvas. And this casts all of the front figures into some kind of shadow. The figure in the foreground who's walking in right ahead of Christ, by the way, actually casts the most shadow there. And he uses that shadow so that this is the calling of St. Matthew, so that Christ can come in the shadow raise his lit arm out to call Matthew. And if you think you've seen that gesture before, it's right out of the Sistine Chapel ceiling and Michelangelo's creation of David, which we will see very soon. Now let's look at another work. This is Caspar David Friedrich, a German artist, Woman at Setting Sun, Morning Light. It's done in 1818, and again, the figure herself is overlapping the entire landscape, which gives us a good idea that that next hill will be overlapping the next hill and so forth. As I said, it's somewhat so simplistic that a lot of time we don't even think about it, but overlapping plays a great role in setting up the sense of space that we have here. We also have shading, and I think if we got close to that figure, we'd realize that her gown actually has folds in it and rolls that are beautifully shaded to show existence of space. And finally, she casts a shadow. We know that there's some debate in this painting as to whether the sun is coming up or going down, but we know definitely she's facing the sun because she casts a lovely shadow behind her. Now in the 20th century, with abstract and non-representational painting, there was the need for illusionism rescinded. But there are other references of space, such as drips of paint layered over one another, that continue to establish a sense of space. This is another work by Franz Klein, whose work we saw in the last lecture. This is Untitled from 1959, and interestingly, this is oil on paper. Now here you can see how clearly one very large brushstroke overlaps another of a different color. Just like the dog in the column, we read it as space. And you can have a lot of fun with an abstract work, sometimes just playing this game of looking at what overlaps what. And you eventually should be able to tell which color went on first. Here it's probably the white, and which color went on last. And here a lot of people would say, oh, that's the black. It wasn't, because look at the blue on the right. The blue slightly overlaps that last massive black stroke. So that's a very good game to play. Now, we've talked a lot about shapes, and now we're going to change and talk about mass. Mass and how space work around it together is a lot like figure ground. Now, this is the work of an Italian sculptor, Bernini, and it's called Apollo and Daphne. It's from 1622 to 25. And Bernini is known for his extremely dynamic sculpture. This tells the story of Daphne when she's trying to run away from Apollo, and he turns her into a laurel tree. The whole sculpture is meant to be seen around from every angle. Always remember, this is called sculpture in the round. But the mass here, the sculpture, needs to work with the space around it. Like figure ground, we always have to consider both. So we've got this very energetic, dynamic sculpture reaching out into space. At the same time, the space kind of reaches in to the sculpture. I think the best example is if we look at the arm of Apollo that reaches out. Just look at the space that is made between his hand up to his arms and down through his drapery and even to his foot. That's a wonderful shape in and of itself. And so we have the sense of mass and ground space as we had with figure ground. It expands the space occupied while affecting also our point of view and even sense of scale. Now let's look at another work. This is by Constantin Brancuș, who's Romanian. The title is Bird in Space. It's from 1923 to 24. And Brancuș is known for treating the base and pedestals of his own works as if they were individual sculpture. And we've certainly seen him get to this point with this particular work. Now this has a separate base, which you can see there, and the sculpture itself, the bird itself, is that metallic and very shiny area up above. Notice that the sculpture itself is organic, but the base is geometric. Remember what we said about geometric shapes and they're being very stable? It's very emphatic and expressive for a base to be that stable. And on top of that, having this bird figure, and it looks like both a bird getting ready to go into flight as well as a single feather, but it's very organic. Now, 20th century paintings without frames are like sculptural installations, and they also have helped us redefine the parameters of what's flat or mass and what's shape or mass. This is the work of Frank Stella, an American artist. The title is Agbatana. It's number 2 from 1968. And what this is sometimes called contour paintings that are so thick that they actually sit on the floor sometimes like a sculpture. One key to understanding how these exist in space is that normally if you have a painting, you have that canvas that is stretched around a stretcher. And that stretcher is only going to be 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch thick on average. Well, the stretchers for these, and this is again canvas and it is stretched around, it takes a lot to work it around those round contours, but the stretchers in this case are up to maybe 5 inches thick. And if you look very carefully at our slide here, you'll see that if you look at that sort of M figure in brown in the middle, look at where the tip of the M goes down, and you'll see that slight indentation that it is a wide stretcher there. So it becomes somewhere near sculpture, and we call them just installations at this point. Let me show you another example. This is by Marisol Escobar. She goes by Marisol. This is complicated. She's American, but born in Paris of Venezuelan parents. And this is her Last Supper from 1982. Now, a lot of recent sculpture has been named installation because it takes up more space and often becomes interactive with the viewer. This happens to be her appropriation of Leonardo. She's borrowed his faces, his poses, everything, but instead she's mounted them on these heavy blocks of wood and made them, instead of being this beautiful, almost transparent illusion, they become these clunky blocks of wood and take up space in very, very different ways. The artist includes herself. Her self-portrait is also a block of wood that she'll set out some point so that she can sit as the block of wood watching her own creation. So she takes what originally was an illusion of space and makes it deliberately, clumsily occupy the space. Let's look at an example overall. This is Michelangelo, and this is a shot of the full Sistine ceiling. Now, I know this can be really intimidating. If you happen to be seeing this in the original, it means you are in Rome, you're at the Vatican, and you've been tripping over Renaissance masterpieces with every step. So you go into the Sistine Chapel, and it's quite normal to be overwhelmed. But think about that bookshop or the library that we talked about in the very first lecture. Look until you see something that really interests you, and then start reading. Now, I've already pre-selected one. This is one of the main of 9 panels in the ceiling, and it is a creation of Adam. And we want to look at this in terms of the shapes and how the shapes are working in this very famous painting. Now here, the entire design consists of only 2 strong shapes. You've got Adam on the left, whose shape itself and whose relative body in it is fairly simple. But look at that shape on the right. God the Father is in a very complicated shape. It's a swirling, energetic shell of drapery, and he is surrounded by baby angels, as well as that woman who peers out from under his arm and looks with great suspicion towards Adam. And that figure, of course, would be Eve. Now, the composition, which we'll learn soon, is the overall design. Could in fact seem like too much, too overwhelming with all that's going on the right. But in fact, what saves that is that there is a third main shape, and that would be this white background or ground. Think of that royal vase that we looked at and try to look at the void as the figure, the same way we saw suddenly the profiles emerge. Look at it as a figure. When you do see that, you'll see that if it's dominant, it takes over a lot of the left side and very little of the right. It's also important that Adam is not on a single little rock, but rather on that sweeping hill. He needs that amount of visual space and that size of a shape to balance him and, we might say, hold his own weight. Now, what would happen if you had the same Adam but on a much smaller shape behind him? We've altered here the shape so that you can see that this really changes. Just the fact that those two shapes aren't equal in size really changes a lot, because it makes God the Father look like he's really running in at Adam rather than meeting him at a certain point. And this is very important. Let's bring Adam back to his original shape that he deserves and realize that Adam is supposed to look listless because he is a body at this point without a soul. God, on the other hand, is the energy of the entire universe at the point of creation. And he must have that sense of energy, but he must be focused on one single intersection, those two fingers, so that he can have energy, but not speed. It should not look as if God is going to speed through and run into Adam. So that balance of shape, we realize, becomes so very important. And this represents the spark of divinity that was the main belief of the Renaissance scholars and theologians in the time of Michelangelo. So the void in the end is not dominant. The point where the intersection of two fingers is the focal point. And we are led very carefully by these two shapes to look first and last at that one focal point, which becomes an almost stopped moment of creation. Now let's do one more very quickly together. This is back to Picasso, Girl Before a Mirror in 1932. There are only three major shapes. There's two figures, which are organic, but also the mirror itself, which is geometric but oval. Remember, the more dynamic of the geometric shapes. The directional main line of all three shapes is vertical, and it's made more emphatic by the diagonal pattern shapes in the background. In fact, this is the key to the work. If this is so brightly colored that it would be very confusing, but you've got geometric shapes in the background, mostly organic shapes in the foreground, and that can keep them separated. Now let's look at one other very clever thing about Picasso's use of shape. Look at the faces. There's a single line going down the middle of the face, which makes a profile shape on one side and a full mask-like face on the other. And he does somewhat the same thing with the face of the reflection. And because of the coloration, the profile looks natural. Because of the coloration, the full shape looks like a mask. So this is a great example of Picasso maneuvering those. Now, he painted this in the time that he was interested in surrealism, psychology, and the inner workings of the subconscious mind. So we just learned from our reading of the colors and shapes that the girl is not looking at her own outer self with the mirror, but rather is engaged in deep introspection. So let's sum up how to assess upon first viewing a work of art, its place, how to see how it's displayed in space, your relationship, the types of shapes, all have associations to go with them. Now let's look at tools. The first tool would be simply identifying the shapes. Are they organic or geometric? Notice how and whether the sense of three-dimensionality is suggested in the work. Do objects in the work overlap? Are shadows visible? And finally, is the shape the figure or the void around it the ground? Or is the shape the ground, making the void read as the figure? Ask yourself, how does the impression of mass and space in the work influence my reaction to it? So now we are ready to put color, line, shape, and space together. And at the next lecture, we'll look at the whole picture, the composition.